Take a look at this. This nun posing as the tail of the letter Q, this guy aiming a sponge at a rat, and this overweight guy all have one thing in common. These are all self-portraits. They're the depiction of the artist by themselves. That's essentially what a self-portrait is, right? It's an artist depicting the portrait of themselves in their art. It could be a portrait drawing of them. It could be a painting, a sculpture. More modernly, it would be a video or a photo, and it could even be a selfie. The genre of self-portrait has a very special place in the history of art and in the practice of art. So many artists tend to lean heavily on portraying themselves in their works. It is a genre that brings with itself a lot of questions and perspectives on what self means and what it means to be an individual. Now, here's the thing. When you think of self-portraits, or if you have studied history of art even a little bit, when thinking of self-portraits, you're probably going to think about works from Renaissance and after that. And that's true. Self-portraits really became a thing from Renaissance onwards and became a serious genre in the 18th century. But among the art that survived from before then, you can find some instances of self-portraits as well. I'm talking about the ancient world of Egypt and Greece up to the Middle Ages. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. So let's take a look at the roots of self-portraits in the Antiquity and the medieval era. Before taking a look at the self-portrait of this guy and his wife, let's first ask the question, why do we care? Why is it a whole genre of art for itself? Why do historians and art theorists study self-portraits aside from portraits? I mean, self-portraits are kind of portraits, aren't they? Well, the weight and importance of this genre comes from the self. What is self? Well, that's too complicated. Is self how I look and what my physical appearance is? Or maybe it's beyond that. It could be my mind and my ideas and my beliefs. Is self the way I see, understand, and think about the world around me? Or is it the way that the world sees me, the way that people around me see me? Is self how I really am? Or is it perhaps the way I want to be, the way I want the society to see me? Is self something that always remains the same? Or does it keep changing all the time? Do I have only one self or 1,000 selves? Is self different when I'm with my friends and when I'm with my co-workers? And many other questions like this that have shaped the opinions of people and thinkers from Plato up until now. And the awesome thing about self-portraits is that we can see the reflection of these different ways of thinking about the self in the history of self-portraits. So here's the plan. We're going to go through the history of self-portraits in a few videos, and we're going to see this idea of self change through time through the lens of self-portrait pieces of art. And guess what? It doesn't start with the 15th century Renaissance, when the idea of the importance of the individual came to be. That's going to be the next step of our journey. It actually begins in the far away times of ancient Egypt, 2,700 years ago. This is the tomb of Ptahhotep, a vizier in 25th century BC in the 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt. The tomb walls are covered in reliefs, showing people in different acts, mostly giving offerings. In one small corner, you can see this guy, sitting in a boat, having a drink. This is one of the oldest self-portraits ever known. This is Giannachi, if that's how it's pronounced, and he's believed to be the chief artist who oversaw the construction of the reliefs in this tomb. Then, more than 1,000 years after this tomb, an artist named Bok creates this sculpture. Bok was the chief sculptor for the pharaoh Akhenaten in 14th century BC, and he depicts himself next to his wife. And make no mistake, he's not an ordinary peasant. No, look at that belly. He's showing that he is actually in the upper echelon of the society and he can eat. Bok also appears in another stele. in this one, you can see the pharaoh Akhenaten giving offerings to the sun god. At their feet, you can see Bok and his father. In the description of the stele, it says that Bok learned his skills directly from Pharaoh Akhenaten. So we can see that the artist has depicted himself in a way that actually shows his societal status and his close relationship with the most powerful man in the land. Now, fast forward another 900 years and you can see almost the same thing happening, this time in the Greece of 5th century BC. This is a story that Plutarch, the 1st century AD thinker, writes in one of his books. He says that Phidias was attacked and imprisoned. Phidias is the top sculptor of ancient Greece. He was the guy who built the statue of Zeus in Olympia that was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Based on the story, Phidias was supposed to make a statue of the goddess Athena. On Athena's shield, he carved a scene of a battle between the Greeks and the Amazonians. And it seems that in this grand battle, he has put himself back to back with the leader of Athens, Pericles. And that didn't go well with the enemies of Pericles. So they captured Phidias. There are no remaining signs of the actual statue, but there are exact copies that still remain. And unfortunately, that's the case for all ancient Greek and Roman self-portraits. All that remain are descriptions in texts and books. Another example is the description of a lady called Iaia of Cyzicus, who was a rich woman because of her ability to draw portraits, and it seems she also painted her own portrait by looking at herself in the mirror and painting. In the 15th century, Boccaccio, in his famous book listing the biographies of famous women, talks about the same tale, this time calling her Marcia, with this description and the depiction of her in action. It seems this lady used mirrors for self-portraits when it wasn't yet a thing. We'll talk about this whole mirror thing in the Renaissance video. So, although we have a lot of portraits and statues from the ancient Greece and Rome, they haven't found any surviving self-portraits. Maybe we could explain that by taking a look at the general idea and view towards artists back then. For example, Plato, the famous Greek philosopher, viewed artists with suspicion in his vision of an ideal society. And famously, in his utopian city, he sees no place for the artists because artists promote the imagination and fantasy, among other reasons. Even Plutarch, that recounts the story of Phidias and Athena's shield, says this about artists. No gifted young man, upon seeing the Zeus of Phidias at Olympia, ever wanted to be Phidias. For it does not necessarily follow that if a work is delightful because of its gracefulness, the man who made it is worthy of our serious regard. So basically, he's saying, your art is good, thank you for that, but you have nothing to be proud of. And why would someone make a self-portrait of themselves when supposedly nobody really cares who was behind the piece of art? Before we go to the medieval era, if you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Much appreciated. Alright, now let's leave the classic world and move into the Middle Ages. So Middle Ages in Europe is from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the beginning of Renaissance in the 15th century. Generally, when we think about the Middle Ages, some basic things come to mind. Christianity, church, Pope, Jesus. And in art, depictions of Christianity, church, Pope, and Jesus, either in religious buildings or a lot of times in books. Generally, the common belief is that the individual meant nothing in the Middle Ages. It didn't matter who you are, you're a sinner, and you should devote your life to the religion. Or as an artist, you're okay with being an anonymous nobody, and you should work based on the rule of Saint Benedict, which is a guide to being a good clergyman, as it says that the craftsmen should pursue their craft in the most humble way. That's what people generally believe, but that's not how it went exactly. In the self-portraits that survived from the Middle Ages, we can see an urge to let others know for certain who was behind the art. Most of the surviving self-portraits of Middle Ages are in illuminated books. Illuminated books are these old parchment books that have calligraphy text decorated with painting motifs and gold leaves around it. And it is in such a book that Saint Dunstan depicts himself bowing at the feet of Christ. Saint Dunstan was a very influential clergyman, calligrapher, painter, metalworker, a minister to a few English kings, and very popular in the 10th century. So he was an important figure. And this drawing on his Latin grammar book comes with a prayer that tells us who this little figure is. I ask, merciful Christ, that you may protect me, Dunstan, and that you do not let the Tiernerian storm drown me. And Christ isn't minding him, looking to his right, where the righteous should stand. And Dunstan, on the left, is not one of the righteous, but he hopes to be. Something close to this is made by Matthew Paris in mid-13th century. Here, the artist is shown kneeling under a picture of Virgin and Child, and he is writing and telling us that he is the prince of the scribes, and his reputation will forever remain. The interesting part in these works is that the person is shown as being small and bent and sinful, but at the same time, they're both shown to be close to Jesus. They are shown to be important, influential people. And both of these self-portraits also act as the artist's sign under their work. You can find this tradition of self-portraits living in the margins as signs in other works too. This is a page from a 12th century encyclopedia by Harold of Landsberg. She was a nun, and in this page she is introducing the religious community. And she is herself present in the margin. How do we know that? Because she has her name written on top, like all the other faces. Here, another nun named Gouda has portrayed herself inside of a letter with her name above it. And the nun named Clarissa draws herself as a part of the letter. She is the tail of Q, and her name is above it. All these drawings of nuns look the same. They all have the same type of clothing, and the face doesn't really show any details of the actual face. But we know who's who because of the names. Look at this one. Here you can see a huge letter R with the artist sitting inside with his tools completing the painting. This is Rufius of Weisenow, and he has painted himself painting his own initial. The artist is small and the letter is huge, so it actually looks like he is not only painting the work, but he is constructing it like a building or a monastery. But my favorite medieval portrait is definitely this one. At first, when you look at it, it all seems normal. You can see the scribe Hildebertus at work with his assistant Everinus. How do we know their names? Again, it's right above their heads. This whole tradition of writing people's names above their head in medieval art reminds me of games with the characters' name tags above their heads. Anyway, what is happening here is that Hildebertus is distracted from his work. A mouse is running across the food table. It has knocked the roasted chicken off the table, and now it's going for the bread. And Hildebertus is about to throw a sponge at him. You can interpret the image as saying that Hildebertus isn't fazed by the earthly distractions of food and gluttony. But even with small distractions like this, he has continued to finish off the super long book of City of God by St. Augustine, where this image is actually from. And his position clearly shows him as the master above Everinus, who is only the assistant. These two also appear together in another self-portrait by Hildebertus under the picture of Gregory the Great surrounded by clerics. There are also a couple of surviving sculpture self-portraits from Middle Ages in religious buildings. One of them is the self-portrait of Vulvinus on the golden altar of St. Ambrosio in Milan. He is believed to be the master maker behind this golden altar made in the 9th century. And here he is receiving a golden crown from St. Ambrosio himself. How do we know? You know the drill by now. there are name tags above their heads. So the artist has elevated his place by showing himself receiving honor from the saint. Something similar happens in St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, made by master mason Peter Parler in mid-14th century. Here he includes his own sculpture among the sculptures of the king and the queen and other high clergymen. Fun note, when I was looking for the work of Peter Parler, Google was insisting on showing me Spider-Man photos. So you can kind of see the pattern of self-portraits in both Antiquity and Middle Ages. None of the works are standalone works of art that depict a portrait of the artist. None of them use the actual likeness of the artist. I mean, you don't recognize the artist because of the details of the face that is painted. You recognize them because of the description or the name tag above their head. And you can see how the artist has used the self-portrait to show that they aren't just the common man, by either putting themselves close to the higher authorities or rulers and saints, or in a religious context like placing themselves next to the image of Christ. So in general, these self-portraits aren't displays of artists' individual self-expression. No, they were a way for the artist to sign their work and put themselves in a higher social context. All the individuality stuff will come later on, but we'll talk about that in the next video in this History of Self-Portraits series. So don't forget to subscribe so you wouldn't miss that video. Also, have you ever seen any of the self-portraits in this video before? And was it surprising for you that self-portraits were a thing in the Middle Ages? Because for me, it was pretty surprising. I had no idea that these exist. So I'm looking forward to your comments. By the way, if you're watching this video later on in the future, check the description. I'll probably have links to the rest of the video series once I've made them in the description for you. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. This is extremely helpful. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.